Live session? No. Okay. Are we on? We're on. Okay, so welcome to our first Resilience Live session for the Transforming Development MOOC. I am Michele-Lee Moore. I'm the Deputy Director of the GRADE program. And with me is Belinda Reyers and Johan Rockström, both of the GRADE program and Stockholm Resilience Center. So we're sitting here in Stockholm, Sweden, and are happy that you're joining us from various parts of the world. We have a number of questions that you have already been contributing into the discussion forums. So we've been taking a look at those and we'll go through those. Some of those, we probably won't get to everything, but those of you that are joining us live and are able to be online right now, if you have other questions you'd like us to cover, now's the chance, or even just comments and reflections back, please feel free to submit those on the forum and we'll have those feeding in on our iPad here. So we're happy to engage and interact with you. So Belinda and Johan, you know, there's more than 3,300 people already signed up for the course. So potentially several thousand of you on there today. So to begin with, I think one of the first places that we can start, it seemed like there were a lot of questions coming in around just clarifying some terminology that we're using in the first module around resilience, around sustainability. We talk about transforming to sustainability using resilience thinking, and I think that can trip people up. So maybe we could just spend some time clarifying how we use these words in this course. I don't know, who would you like to start?
I can just start setting a bit of the frame, and even though, I mean, this whole MOOC is about resilience for development. So of course, even though we have a lot of evidence and maintain that resilience is so fundamental for development, I think it's important to recognize that sustainability is the mother term. This is the overarching paradigm on meeting the needs of this generation for human well-being in a way that does not undermine the possibility of future generations of meeting their needs and wants and aspirations for a good life and development. So we are showing scientifically, and the evidence we have is that resilience is a prerequisite to be able to attain sustainability. So it doesn't replace sustainable development, it's a component for sustainable development. And to put it very simple, I mean, once upon a time, roughly 50 years back, you could argue that we could actually deliver sustainable development without resilience, because we had ample natural capital, we had ample biodiversity, we had stable rainy seasons, we had a hydrological cycle that was operating very stably, we had a climate system that was within all forms of planetary boundaries. We were living in a relatively stable environmental state. But then we entered the whole great acceleration and the Anthropocene, and we have come to this globalized phase where shocks and stress are part of the new normality. And this rising degree of turbulence in the social, economic, and environmental sphere in a globalized world has put resilience at the central stage. And we can today argue that the only way to succeed with sustainability is through social, ecological resilience means. So it's a path towards sustainability, but it's not something that replaces or substitutes sustainability. And then finally, one thing that I always personally find quite useful is to remember sustainability is always good. I mean, it's something we're always striving for, but resilience can be good or bad. Sometimes you have to break resilience to be able to transition towards your desired pathway. I mean, a poverty trap can be very resilient, unfortunately. You can be stuck in a virtuous cycle. Some dictatorships are very resilient. So that's also a good way of distinguishing the two concepts, that sustainability is always good, resilience can be good or bad. And that's why you have to use it as a tool for strength, basically.
Yeah, that's nice. And they do get used interchangeably sometimes, but I think we're trying to really clarify that in this. I don't know if you want to add anything.
Yeah, I mean, I think just to build on that, I think that when we're also talking about sustainability throughout this MOOC, we're meaning much more than just environmental sustainability. And I think as Johan defined, we see it as about, societal and individual and planetary well-being really in the longer term. And I think that part of this MOOC is also trying to challenge this dichotomy between environment and development, which we would all argue is a false dichotomy. And so I think it's also just important to keep that in mind, that we are talking about sustainability of the social and ecological in the longer term. And then I guess it's helpful there that sustainability will always be a desirable outcome. Resilience, when interpreted as an outcome, can be good and bad. And often in this move, we're actually not even talking about resilience as an outcome, but rather resilience as a perspective or as an approach to think about how we achieve sustainability and the necessary ingredients of persistence, adaptation, and transformation required to get there. So I think it is good. I mean, we do have the glossary that we've created for the MOOC to try and get very clear on this terminology, because it can be really confusing, and I think we're using them in quite specific ways in this MOOC that may be unfamiliar to many in the development community. So it's really helpful to see these questions coming out so early on. We also have a whole module that digs into, a whole chapter that digs into the relationship between resilience and the biosphere, and people in the biosphere and nature and culture, I think, which will be an interesting perspective, I think, for those interested in the space between resilience and sustainability.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And just so people are aware, that's a reference to what will be Module 5 that will be coming up in the future weeks.
And then just to complement what you said, because you ran over it so quickly, I mean, when we think about resilience as a perspective, we think of it in these three components that kind of build up the way we kind of address resilience, both the persistency, adaptability, and transformability. And I think it's important to keep these really in mind, because persistence fundamentally is the origins of resilience theory. It's the most narrow view of resilience, but it is important to recognize that in some cases, you really want to be able to avoid change. You want to remain in your desired state, and that is persistency, the ability of how much shocks and stresses you can take and still bounce back or remain in one specific state. And interestingly, which is something that is actually at the very frontier of science, so it's not really even at the center of perhaps this module, but it appears that the higher you go in scale, the more persistency matters. So if you think at the planetary scale, you don't want to push the whole Earth system away from its interglacial state where it has been since the last ice age. So there you could say persistency really matters. But then the more you come down to community level, the more you want to invest in the second component, which is adaptability. Your ability to remain in one desired state, but be able to be flexible and adapt to changing conditions. And as we are focusing so much in this module, the third component of resilience on transformations is probably the most important one in this stage of rapid change, because we recognize so much that poverty alleviation and development today is so much about being able to find new trajectories for aspirational and positive development. So it's good to keep all these three in mind and never interpret resilience just as either transformation or persistency or adaptation. It's the whole paradigm.
Yeah, and that's an important point, because I think a number of people were asking about that, about our mitigation. What's the difference between mitigation and resilience, or what's the difference between climate change adaptation and resilience? And I think
and mitigation, strictly speaking, is about persistence. It's about avoiding too much stress and shock.
Yeah.
So
it's a component of, but just one part of what we understand to be part of it. But you were going to add something there.
Yeah, well, I think that, I did race through those, and I think that they are a central core of this MOOC. And I think we're never trying to say that they're mutually exclusive, right? I think any sort of journey towards sustainability or towards improvements in well-being or the reduction of poverty is going to involve components of things that should persist, things that should adapt, and things that need to transform. And it's interesting that you bring up the scale points as well, because one also is interested in those cross-scalar connections between what's persisting at one scale, what needs to transform at another scale, and thinking that through with things like the global economic system or national economic development and those linkages, or the global trade system. So I think there's a lot of interesting stuff in there that we'll be digging into in this MOOC, but also just be really interesting to get feedback from many of our participants in this course who actually are working largely on local scale challenges and thinking through these three dimensions of persist, adapt, transform, but also across the scales. at which they apply to their work. Should we get onto the climate one?
Yeah,
I think
well,
the climate one's a little linked.
Yeah, that is actually. So that is coming from, there were quite a few of you actually who obviously have, your connection to resilience has been through the climate change space. Certainly a big part of many development efforts. And so some people are asking about the steps between how you build climate change resilience, or is it related to, how is that related to resilient when you're undertaking certain climate change, whether it's mitigation or adaptation or transformation initiatives? So I think we're kind of wondering about that relationship a little bit.
Yeah.
You want to start with that one?
Well, I mean, I guess just really off the top of my head on that one is the scale. Again, like I think a lot of the climate resilience work that I'm aware of focuses on making the local scale resilient to disasters, in reducing risk, mitigating risk. And that's such a central component, I think, to a lot of development work at the moment. There's also increasingly a focus in that on adaptation and what can be done at the local scale to adapt. What I hear about less is what are the other scales and other transformations that are required, because I think we could all keep persisting and adapting and yet never really move people out of poverty or move people out of these vulnerable situations without some of the larger scale transformations. So, that's also interesting to think about the opportunities this climate change resilience space opens for us. And I'm sure, Johan, you have lots of reflections on that. But again, how do we bridge these three dimensions and the multiple scales really involved in climate change? And again, the dimensions of the social, the ecological, and the resilience of those various dimensions too.
Yeah, and it opens up this whole world in terms of what are we talking about when we're talking about our approaches to development, because it might mean that we shift from just thinking only investing or funding or starting programs at a very local level to also recognizing, but that's absolutely necessary. That's going to be an immediate response to alleviate the suffering that might happen from certain natural disaster events. But what's causing those natural disaster events, and what kind of cross-scale dimensions matter to that? How does that play a role in development? I don't know if you have any reflections.
Well, I think it's really important to recognize that the strongest links between climate change and resilience is really that climate change is a driver of increased frequency and amplitudes of shocks and stress. So you could say that human-induced climate change is driving the need for more resilience. I mean, just simply put. So the more we destroy the climate system and the more risks we take with the climate system, the more we know today that we'll have higher degrees of shocks and stresses, which means we have to invest even further in resilience. The important thing to recognize there, though, is that that there's such a difference between. I mean, it's often said with regard to climate change that our challenge is to manage the unavoidable, but also avoid the unmanageable. And the first step about managing the unavoidable is unfortunately something we've had to come to recognize. We are already at 1.1 degrees Celsius warming. We're largely committed to 1.5. We have many scholars rightly claiming that it's even difficult to see how we can stay much under 2. And this means that we are unavoidably heading towards a future where we'll have more pandemics of different kinds of diseases, we'll have more shocks and stresses of droughts and floods, we'll have more heat waves, we'll have very, very big differences in compositions of the whole social ecological system that we depend on for our livelihoods across all scales, which means that we unavoidably need to invest in resilience. And that's one important domain to really recognize. And I think what's so important in our MOOC is that we are showing that those investments to build resilience towards unavoidable climate change have very little to do with climate change. They've all to do with stewardship of the biosphere. They have to do with how we manage water, how we manage biodiversity, how we manage land, how we manage coast, how we manage coral reefs, how we manage fisheries, because that's the only way for us to prepare ourselves to navigate that unavoidable future. And of course, you have how do we avoid the unmanageable? We simply need to avoid entering a domain of let's say, where our investments in resilience won't be enough, where we might have collapse of societies because we might get in such a dire situation at 2, 3, 4 degrees Celsius warming. And that's where the mitigation parts comes in so strongly. And this is, of course, going a little bit to the higher order of complexity. But it's quite interesting how these actually interconnect, because we find more and more evidence to show that many of the most clever mitigation investments are actually about investing in resilience building in the biosphere. If you want to sequester carbon in a forest system, you want to maintain highly diverse forest systems, which in turn can deliver better resilience to manage,
Right.
climate change. So it's not as if they're completely decoupled, but it's a very important area of. You could say it's very unfortunate in a way that we'll need so much resilience because it's driven so much by climate change.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And really changes, again, a lot of the investments being made at these under the climate change banner are looking at things like early warning systems, which are very different than, maybe we actually should be thinking about reforestation in these other areas. So as one example.
And I guess, the power of resilience and the resilience perspective in the climate change domain is that it opens up new opportunities to come up with different solutions. I think in the work that we've been doing, for example, in South Africa, disaster and climate change is a very disempowering space for municipal and city managers and development agencies, because it is just about coping with these shocks and stresses and kind of disaster-proofing communities, which, considering the challenge, that can be very disempowering. And then I think what we have found is through adopting this resilience perspective, which brings in thinking about the social ecological linkages, but also at the cross-scalar linkages, it opens up far more powerful partnerships and opportunities to actually drive more appropriate patterns of land use change, so essential to the management of river systems and forest systems linked to things like flood and fire and drought, which I think are sort of fundamental challenges within this disaster risk space. So we have actually found this to be a much more positive space to engage in around some really substantial challenges, acknowledging that, as Johan said, this is the new normal. It's not like we just have to get through this phase of more disasters and then we'll get back to a world that's free of disasters, that they are, droughts in big cities like Cape Town. This is the new normal. And doing the old practices of just digging more aquifers and building higher seawalls is sufficient in some ways, but really probably going to only take us so far, especially if we think about the challenges of sustainability. And so actually looking to these other avenues of how can we use the biosphere, the local environment, our water systems, new approaches to food security, new partnerships with business and the private sector in those spaces as well, has been actually quite an empowering space to work in. So I think in that way, we really are trying to show in this MOOC how resilience opens up new and potentially more positive approaches for development in some very challenging spaces.
So I just want to pick up on one very small thing that we keep using the term social ecological.
Yes,
yeah,
we do.
Social ecological resilience. That's that's our perspective that we're coming from. But someone who's live with us has just been asking the difference between, or do we move beyond that to also think about social ecological? And I know I often get the question, well, what about social technological? And so I think we use these as big umbrella terms, but maybe we could take a minute to clarify sort of what we're encompassing in the social ecological perspective. Yes. Anyone wants to take a crack at that? Maybe it's too broad.
So I guess, and that's also something I dig into a bit in the lecture I give this week, is really what we mean by social ecological is about the fact that we don't really see a sensible division between people and their environment and their places, that we acknowledge that there are deep relationships between people and their environment, and that actually this sort of Western construct of nature and society doesn't necessarily fit the kinds of challenges that we're dealing with. And as Johan said, maybe in the 1950s, when there was abundant natural resources and widely undegraded ecosystems and people were sort of free to use whatever they needed to develop, this was less important. But actually, as we've gone into this real sort of worldview of an ability to divide nature from society and build cities that don't acknowledge the connections people have to the food and water and cultural systems and dependence and values, as well as the sort of mental well-being aspects, we're seeing a lot kind of going wrong with development. And so I guess in my mind, it just that hyphen in social ecological is really what I think a lot about. It's actually how we are linked to our environment. And by that, I don't only mean rural people in their local environments. I think we're linked to where our food comes from, where our water comes from, the pictures we enjoy seeing on television about natural systems we may never visit. So it's just actually acknowledging the fact that maybe this Western approach to dividing environment now and developing in the Anthropocene.
And it's not about leaving off under the social banner. I think we're not leaving off economic or technological or cultural or spiritual. I think those are all embedded.
That's why I would, to tidy things up a little bit, because what Belinda is saying is so important. I would actually argue that social technological and social ecological are not comparable paradigms at the same level. No. The overarching mother term is social ecological. Mm-hmm. And under that, you can of course have social technological or social philosophical or social economic thoughts, but the overarching, just as we started off this discussion, that sustainability is the mother term. In that sense, social ecological is the mother term. Mm. I mean, I think it's often sometimes, it might sound a bit simplistic, but it's sometimes good just to step back in whatever place you're sitting in. Like we're sitting in this room, there's not one element in this environment, even though it's so anthropocentrically created, that does not come from nature. Mm-hmm. Everything we do, everything we depend on, every step we take, every good and service we consume, always depend on natural capital. Mm. So it is about this interconnectedness between the social and the ecological. You don't have to call it ecological. You can call it social environmental if you want. That's the same thing. The origins of social ecological is actually that it comes from the recognition that ecology represents the living environment, namely the biosphere, which thereby is kind of the fundamental anchoring of the social ecological. But you could call it social environmental also if you feel more comfortable in that sense, to incorporate both the climate system and all abiotic non-living parts of the environment, like heavy metals and rare earth metals and different components of the geosphere. But the whole point is that this interconnectedness between, I often just call it the world and earth. It's kind of a world-earth integration. Yeah. It's nature-society integration. That's the overarching paradigm. And I think we have come to this insight that in this globalized phase of the Anthropocene, if we're not able to reconnect our own development to the environment or to the ecology or to the biosphere, then we are in dire situation in terms of our trajectories to the future. And then we add to that the need to invest in resilience. I think that's
And it also makes you a lot in the development space. It's made me reflect a bit. There's obviously the natural resource reason for thinking about our environment. But, we sit in this room, a Swede, a Canadian, and a South African, and our identities and our cultures and our intellects and our psychology has been shaped by the environments that we grew up in. And I think this becomes really key when we start thinking about the sort of migration, conflict context that development is dealing with, is thinking about how much that hyphen, that social, environmental, social, ecological, is also so deeply integrated into our well-being and our sense of identity, and what that means for a development that acknowledges the fact that we are dealing with more mobile populations and groups and a more connected context. And I think that there's a lot of work going on in trying to dig into how important those links actually are to our well-being and how to look after those as we're starting to see people moving around a lot more, and how to be able to make sure that well-being isn't just about making sure there's food on the table and money in your wallet, but also how much of this is linked to your cultural sense of well-being, your psychological sense of well-being too. And I think that is a fundamentally different perspective on the systems we're dealing with in development than has maybe been in the past, because of this need to keep environment and development separate. Now I think we have an enormous opportunity to recognize how deeply they're actually connected.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's a nice, in some ways, we're hardly the first people. There are so many different cultural traditions and ways of knowing that have long valued and held tightly onto this important relationship. So we're not the only people. Of course, we use a certain terminology around it. We're not going to be the only people talking about this. But at the same time, I think in some ways it's become something a little bit new for the development space right now, in that development has kind of disconnected and decoupled from that relationship. And so I think in some ways it's our contribution or what we can offer into this space right at this particular moment, and sort of our intention behind some of this, sharing some of this thinking in the MOOC. I wanted to pick up on, you mentioned migration and conflicts, and I know there's a number of participants that are working in various areas. We have some working in Iraq, Syria. People are asking questions about the link between resilience and post-conflict areas. We have a question on the live stream as well, mentioning corruption. And so just recognizing there are very different contexts in which suddenly development investments are being made in building resilience or in some type of resilience programming. And is it possible in all these different contexts? And what's the relationship between those kinds of contexts and what we're talking about around social ecological resilience and transformations to sustainability? And I think it's not a simple question, but maybe we could spend some time talking about that just to reflect on some of the questions coming in.
No, it's definitely not a simple question. And I think, just as we discussed even before we started here, that this is a domain where it's not as if we have all the solutions, and we don't even have a lot of research in, for example, resilience building in fragile states or conflict zones. However, I think it's fair to say that from the evidence we have and from the knowledge we have, you could say that the deeper you move into a fragile or conflict or a vulnerable or corrupt state, the more resilience you need. The more relevant it is to think in terms of how do you move out to begin with from a trap that you're stuck in, and how can you navigate as an individual or as a household or as a community those incredibly stressed, shockful, often disastrous conditions that you're under. And this is, of course, so you could say it's almost like ground zero for resilience thinking. And this is something that we would like to, as a Stockholm Resilience Center as well, to understand better what can resilience thinking contribute with in these contexts, because we are starting to learn, and it's surfacing more and more the evidence that conflicts and situations of societal instability, for example in Syria, for example in Sudan, for example with the Arab Spring, cannot be decoupled from both social and ecological abrupt changes. And that this is extremely complex, but that we have more and more evidence that indicate even the Arab Spring had connections with water scarcity, drought, food prices rising in the global market, phosphorus prices pushing that even higher, leading to 300% rise in bread prices in Cairo and Egypt, which then couples to the uprising protests against rising costs of living, and that these are interconnected, turbulent phases that lends itself to increasing recognition that resilience investments. How can you build resilience under circumstances of those kind of fragility domains that we are seeing not only increasingly occurring, but also that are increasingly social ecological. And we haven't experienced that in the past. I mean, this is quite a new phenomenon, actually, that we see these abrupt changes when social and ecological factors interplay in very quick, which is, of course, a result, not least of the globalized, increasingly digital reality we live under, but also with the rising shocks and stresses of ecological changes. So we're in new terrain there, actually.
Yeah, and what's interesting about it is it's no longer just about it's the complexity of how they're interacting, and it's not just about a particular environmental limit. I mean, I think we've long histories, thousands of years. I think communities have struggled with running out of water, for instance, and possibly having to move, or possibly that causing conflicts between groups. But it's actually now it's not just about a limit being reached. It's about these much kind of broader, more complex interactions. I don't know if you want to add anything.
Yeah, I mean, I guess we're about to throw a whole new word into this MOOC, which is the word complexity.
Yeah.
and complex systems, which we're going to have a whole chapter or module on digging into. And
that's next week.
And by that, I think it's always important to acknowledge we don't mean complex as in insoluble. We just acknowledge that this is about systems and many different parts of those systems interacting with each other in often highly dynamic and unpredictable ways. And I don't want to give too much away about that.
It's a good summary.
But I think what I also want to bring into this is that, while we certainly have very limited research on the use of resilience in conflict and fragile states, there is an interest, not interesting, but there is a potential positive match between systems thinking comes from a foundation of complexity theory and complexity science. So it's designed around the complex problem space. And my sense is that the questions we're getting on conflict, on migration, on fragility and vulnerability and corruption, those are also complex problems. They're not linked to a single factor or a single place or even a single time. And so it seems to me that there is a good match between resilience thinking as founded in complexity theory and about complex problems. And then, of course, this problem context that we're all seeing as an emerging series of complex challenges. And I guess, it's really interesting for us through this MOOC and making it as interactive as possible to really see if there is a meeting point between this theory and the practice in the complexity space. And I guess that's more and more why there is this interest from development in resilience, because of the complex nature of some existing challenges, but these new emerging risks that we're seeing increasingly because of the Anthropocene.
Mm-hmm. And again, it kind of goes back to how we're defining what resilience is, as opposed to a specific outcome that's being achieved, but actually as this property of these dynamic systems, and recognizing in some of those contexts, it's persistence that gets a lot of the attention, right, in terms of the immediacy of it. But there's also how are we also thinking about adaptation? How are we also thinking about building transformative capacity in that system at the same time? And I mean, doing that is never going to be easy.
And I think the cross-scale nature of those, like the many of these challenges around migration, conflict, and fragility are not from the local context, but very much shaped by many cross-scale forces in the world across time and across space. And so I think that there's a real sense that resilience helps us bring that set of binoculars and microscopes to be working and zooming in and out of the right scale to really understand the problems that we're trying to address, not to sort of just assume we know what the problem is.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. And I think that actually picks up on there's quite a few questions here about sort of getting down into the individual level of, is resilience, can you develop it in people, or can you develop it in a community? And one person was asking about, is it about knowledge and skills and attitudes? And someone else is asking about, is it about are there certain worldviews or belief systems or faith practices that actually make a difference to people's capacities to remain resilient? So there's some really, I think people are talking about resilience at these very different scales. That's obviously perhaps different than talking about climate change responses or mitigation adaptation efforts, and yet they're all very linked. And I think we talk about resilience. I mean, the reality is there's a lot of really good science going on from this in psychology around personal individual resilience. There's a lot happening in organizational studies, trying to understand what sort of organizational cultures foster resilience and sort of being able to be responsive, adaptive, transformative. What are the kinds of ways that you organize yourself socially? Communities, lots of work on social network ties and the importance of that. So there's these elements, but I think it's still kind of is focusing on one particular scale. And I don't know if either of you have any reflections about that.
Yes, I mean, this will be our challenge, right? Because we care about resilience at so many scales. Obviously, the individual is important, the community, the system that community is in, and then the whole global planetary system. I mean, we're interested in resilience. And again, coming back to Johan's point, as a good and a bad thing on that system, and thinking about what needs to persist, what needs to adapt, what needs to transform, and how those are linked. So I guess a lot of what we're presenting in this MOOC is more focused potentially at the system and maybe national and regional scale interlinkages to what matters to the community and the individual. There are a lot in the development resilience and community resilience disciplines that we're learning a lot from, how those link. I mean, in answer to many of these questions, I'm sorry to say I don't think there is a magic equation that resilience equals this much money, plus this much education, plus this much access to loans and insurance. I just think that doesn't seem to be what happens on the ground. And so I think we are very interested in resilience as capacities, individual and community and organizational and national capacities to persist, adapt, and transform. We're learning a lot about what that looks like, the fact that it's made up of resources and skills and abilities as well as agency, and the fact that it's so shaped by stuff that happens outside of the individual too, and by context. And I could have exactly the same capacities as someone living in Cape Town, here as I live in Stockholm. And yet the things we're exposed to will test our capacities and our resilience in very different ways. So the role of context becomes so important here too. So, I mean, I guess that needs to be one of the mother messages here too. We really don't believe in the silver bullet. I don't think anyone working and signing up for this course believes that there is a magical equation for building resilience at any scale. I guess my answer is it's all linked. And we do understand some things seem to matter more than others, but they're always so anchored in context.
And that's the challenge, right, of when resilience programming or funding for resilience comes out. And what's that mean? What's that look like? What am I trying to get funding for? Or what's the initiative? Because you have to get it down to this very specific thing. And the reality is what works in one place, or what might actually be enhancing resilience in one place, might be eroding resilience in another place. And so trying to come up with a set of characteristics or a set of here's the programs that you need to undertake for these individuals or this community is
but I guess
really difficult.
I better come in here because it just sounds like I've just said we don't know anything.
That's not our message.
That's not
right?
our message. I guess what we're saying is we're not investing effort on this magic equation or the silver bullet solution, but we do know a lot about capacities to persist, adapt, and transform, and actually how they're different from each other and how they play out in different contexts. We also know a lot about what shapes those capacities, and we're going to dig into that in a lot of these modules, right? How the biosphere shapes those capacities from local to global scales, how the cross-scale dynamics of trade, politics and economics shape those from very local scales to very global scales. So I think that maybe what I'm trying to say is we're not going to help you come up with the magic indicator of resilience of an individual, but we really want to help all of us understand a bit more about what those capacities look like in different places and what really seem to be some key determinants of those capacities, so that we can actually create a sustainable development trajectory that at its heart has the capacities of people, communities, and the systems they live in to be able to navigate this constant and surprising change. So we do know some stuff. Let me not set up some false advertising here. We're just not into the sort of single bullet solution.
Right. It's not a single program or a single intervention.
And the fact that we don't need to single bullet also means that we admittedly do not have solutions for individuals. Specifically, given your point, Belinda, that every context is so specific. But I think it's, as you say, we have learned quite a lot. And I think if there's an additional red thread to your points is also that diversity seems to be the red thread in build resilience, both social diversity and ecological diversity. I think that could be a good thing to bear in mind. And then, of course, you don't have to be an academic to realize that there's so much empirical support for that when you look to social diversity. Because, if you go to yourself as an individual, if you put all your bets on one horse, be it your bank account, or be it your food supply, or be it your shelter, you are more vulnerable. But if you have agency, if you have neighbors you can trust, if you have a community that you can knock on doors when you're in trouble, if you have an insurance system that is both social and economic, then of course you're more resilient. So there is something quite interesting in terms of how we can scale the evidence on diversity as a social resilience builder and ecological resilience builder. It's interesting also that the evidence shows increasingly that it applies equally well on the biophysical side and the social side.
That's right.
in exactly the same way. The more you invest in monocultures and ecosystems, the more brittle the system is, and it can break like this. And the same thing goes for a social system. So we have, of course, lessons here, but one has to humbly recognize the challenge here, and that we want to, I think one message in this MOOC is that we know the parameters we can define. We have a toolbox, we have a lot of knowledge, but if you want to build resilience here or here in your social ecological system, you better build that very much anchored in the knowledge on site, that this is something fundamental. Then your question about value system is very interesting because, that takes us to the temporal scale as well. I think it's really important to recognize that, as far as I know, there's no scientific evidence that suggests that a certain values system would increase or reduce your resilience at the short term. So if you have a certain faith or a certain perspective on life, you could actually argue that it might even be that a very unsustainable, egoistic perspective on life may give you the best resilience in the short term. You're the bullying type of person that simply just stumbles through whatever happens on the short term. But if you think of resilience on the longer term, if you really want to think about your generation and the next generation, then suddenly a value system can really play a role. Because if you have a value system or a faith system that humbly recognizes relationships between human beings, respect between human beings, and connection to your let's say nature around you, and you're a custodian of that in a sustainable way, then you're very likely to have a higher chance of being resilient on the longer term when surprises come along the way. Now we are on the hypothesis frontier here, I think, but it's a very interesting question actually, because I think there's much research required in this area. It's kind of philosophy, resilience area, but where does our personal value system and worldview matter for resilience? I don't know if you have more perspectives on that, but it's an important area actually.
And I think, in some of the analyses that have looked at cases of resilience of various systems, of various facets of systems, we do see that value systems that value learning, that value acknowledging that you live in a system and that there are these interconnected parts, a complexity approach, for example, there does seem to be evidence that those do lead to, in the longer term, systems that are able to keep continuing despite shocks and perturbations. So I agree. I think that there is a lot that we know about things like diversity, like learning, polycentric governance, but a lot of these are hard to interpret at an individual scale, which I think is where where lots of these questions come from. But I think that's also what we're interested in exploring as we go through this MOOC, is how do these principles play out in different contexts. And I think that most people listening in here don't need another 25-step guideline or blueprint to build resilience. We really are looking at how do we learn to work in systems and understand the systems to better be able to build that resilience.
Yeah, and understand how to do that collectively, not just as individuals. Really interesting questions.
Lots of questions.
And now that seemed to have, triggered a whole bunch of new ones. Just going to scroll through for 1 minute. There were a number of questions. Sorry for my pause. There's a number of questions that are coming in that seem to relate to different actors. So there's one that came in earlier around how do you talk about resilience with regards to powerful multinational companies and their dominant role in global economic systems, and another asking about decision makers and how do we influence their thinking. And so there's this range of actors that I think, depending on which sector people are working in and who matters to their current work right now, that people are asking about. Again, I think you're hearing us say there's no magic solution or set of steps that we can say, here's the 5 things you need to do, but any reflections in terms of engaging with these, whether it matters, how it matters, those kinds of things.
That's a big question, and of course, it's a very important question because, well, if you look at if there's any trend line of the last 10 years, it is that businesses, decision makers at all scales are taking on board resilience in a very prominent way, and often just using it as a label, true, but increasingly also, from reinsurance companies to big food industries, taking on resilience as part of their business strategy, and generally, I would argue, in the business sector, seeing resilience, as this, avoiding change that could take you in a negative direction. So really, in being in that persistency fringe of resilience. So of course, what one would want to engage with, I think, the business sector in particular is to understand the value for any business at any scale to understand resilience more in the context of sustainable development and the way we've been discussing it in this MOOC, to see that for a business long-term success, you want to be sure that your the basis for your business, which is generally natural capitals, remains reasonably stable, and that your clients around the world live in peaceful democracies or peaceful countries that are not under violence and fragility, and that you have, any business, to put it simple, thrives better under stable conditions, and therefore has a lot to gain in engaging on resilience beyond its profit statements. So I think and we're not there in any way. When it comes to the policy domain, which also is looking much more at resilience, I mean, remember that United Nations adopted even a full resilience strategy at the COP21 in Paris, and the climate agreement was adopted. So there is this recognition that in order to achieve development, investments in resilience are important, but still it is incredibly vague and it's very rhetoric still. So I think we have a challenge here, kind of concretizing that for different nations. What do you do as a head of state if you want to build a resilient nation? And that has an enormous spectrum. I mean, look at the low-lying island states at risk of basically disappearing under the pressures of global environmental change. They see resilience as a survival strategy for the nations. And if you look at the Maldives or Kiribati, they invest in resilience as a way of protecting themselves from sea level rise. So that's one dimension of resilience in the kind of policy domain. But I think we'll see more and more, like for example, New York City investing more and more, understanding that a hurricane or shock waves of heat waves or storms, you need to build more resilient infrastructure in cities, for example. So it's a very multifaceted area. I just think that recognizing and understanding resilience is a tool to engage in essentially so many sectors today, which will just become increasingly important.
Maybe it goes back to our original discussion around how we are using the terms in this particular course, but I guess in terms of people wondering about how can you influence certain actors, I think it's also one of the set of questions that people can ask themselves of who are you engaging with and how are they using it? Are they meaning it to persist? And what's their kind of agenda behind that? Or are you meaning it to actually transform? You're trying to transform something and there's a difference in how you're understanding and using that term. It might be one of the first steps to take in terms of understanding that. I don't know if you have anything to add.
Well, I guess I keep coming back to this sort of what scale are we talking at? And I think, we by no means does anyone think the private sector is a single entity, right? And so if we're thinking about individual and community resilience, which many people listening in are interested in, and how are the capacities to adapt and transform determined by those individuals and communities, but more and more how they're determined by things outside of those, right? The cross scale. Then, I mean, it's interesting to think about how would that capacity of a community be shaped by the resilience in a private sector entity. Increasingly, we're seeing more and more work around supermarkets and the role they play in food security or food insecurity in informal urban settlements and in the rural context. And so, what do we think about the relationship between the resilience of supermarkets and the resilience of individuals in an increasingly urban world? And how are those two linked? And so I think that much of this to me is why are we interested in that private sector? In many cases, as Johan says, there's an interest in that private sector entity building their own resilience to an increasingly turbulent world that they're working in. And in some sectors, we're seeing greater resilience if we look at the trends in consolidation and growth in several of the big multinationals. They are certainly very resilient to the conditions that they're in now, some are less so. But I think that comes back to, why do we care about that? What does that mean for the development interventions we're trying to do? And that guides a lot, I think, the way we're wanting to work with, say, for example, the insurance and reinsurance sectors that we've engaged with a lot in a very different way from the way we would engage with the food and beverage sector and the role they play in food security in many of these regions too. And increasingly, I think the work that's actually coming from social ecological resilience side, that's looking to understand the global economic, the global trade system, is increasingly useful for understanding what sort of adaptations and transformations are required in that system in order to unlock development opportunities at the scales that people care about here. And Johan was using the climate change example recently, but I think one could easily bring that into the oil palm industry, the deforestation, the cereal industry, the multinationals that are interested in fossil fuels. I mean, I think that nobody's being naive about the role that these companies and multinationals play. But increasingly, I also see the science that we do on social ecological resilience being very useful in understanding how they contribute to the system's resilience, their own, and then the capacities, either building or undermining the capacities for resilience at these other scales. And so perhaps we're seeing here resilience more as almost a diagnostic on these multinationals, and their links to what we're trying to do at the global scale. And how development engages with multinationals will also be interesting to see going forward.
Yeah, and it reminds me of this week in the Mercy Corps video, the framework that they're using around resilience, of what to what, and kind of really mapping that out of, what, when you're engaging in those initiatives and then thinking through the roles of, I think we've seen through the a number of initiatives where you were talking about engaging the private sector, multinational companies, or engaging politicians and decision makers. Is it about trying to increase access to resources? Is that what the hope is? And how does that, again, relate to this dynamics that we're talking about when we're talking about resilience? How's that shaping what you're doing or how you're doing? Is it because actually you see them as contributing to perhaps eroding resilience in the system, or critical to enhancing it? What's the strategy and purpose, and of what to what, for whom, by whom? I think those questions are helpful for thinking some of that through that Mercy Corps.
It also reminds me, we actually had a question about what we mean by development.
That's right.
Which is interesting, because that's a question that's always on my mind. And as these questions come up about policymakers, decision makers, multinationals, in some ways, if we're thinking about development in the sort of narrow international development cooperation way, maybe they're less relevant. But if we're thinking about development as economic development or local development or sustainable development, I think then we're also seeing more and more a central role to play for the private sector there. And so I guess I don't think we've actually come up with a single definition of what we mean by development for GRADE, because we're trying to, and for this MOOC, because we are trying to talk to all those multiple models. We certainly aren't talking about a single development model, like a capitalist model or a neoliberal model. We're not really getting into that kind of worms. We really are trying to think about, I guess, development as this process towards sustainability. And that involves economic development, it involves international development, it involves sustainable development. And so we're hoping to be relevant to all of those domains. But I do think it's important to acknowledge that when we start talking about these other partners, why would we engage with them in these different arenas of development?
Yeah, and there's a question coming in here on the live stream that says, as you're explaining a lot of this, the reality is the way we're talking about resilience doesn't fit well into mainstream development approaches right now.
Exactly.
And actually, mainstream approaches could be diminishing resilience's potential to transform. So what do we do about that? And I think that's why we're here and engaging in this very much in this course. So I think we recognize that some of the things we're saying are a challenge, but then we're also saying, but we don't have all the solutions ourselves here sitting in the Resilience Center in Stockholm. And so that's why we're trying to engage with everybody through this and think this through. But I don't know if either of you have anything to add to that very important question. What do we do, right?
And I wonder if, I mean, in some ways, I totally agree, that this is not mainstream development, but we also have interesting windows of opportunity with things like Agenda 2030, which is a phenomenally different way to think about development as, people, planet, prosperity, all interlinked and all relevant for a fair and just future. And I think that the program that we're all sitting here being part of with the Swedish investments in is really also an attempt by many development agencies and others interested in this to really explore what resilience might hold to offer in an acknowledgement of the challenges of mainstream development approaches to grappling with a lot of long-standing challenges, but many of the emerging challenges that we're only just now starting to see because of these conditions of the Anthropocene and the turbulence and the sort of planetary thresholds that we're approaching. So it's an interesting question because I think it's true that it's not mainstream, but there certainly seems to be an appetite for doing things differently and rethinking and transforming development. And so it's great to see this enormous interest from over 3,000 people participating in this MOOC. It's clearly not just us who thinks that this could be an important way forward. And so, how do we build this as a community of practice and a community of interest, and acknowledge that there is an opportunity in the big global policy domain, and I think also within the international development space, at least, not to be naive to the challenges.
Yeah,
of course.
And I think going back to the theory itself and what we know from the science, it's also a really important time then to be experimenting. That we don't. It's not about just developing. Every country now has to have a national resilience policy, and that's the solution, or scale out some sort of solution that everybody's going to adopt. I think we need to be playing. What does transforming development actually mean, and can we test it over here and run a few pilots over there and actually try some really different kinds of approaches?
Diversity.
Learn from them. Diversity. Yeah, I guess it goes back to your point.
But it also, I think, which can be potentially something that frees up a bit of or releases some pressures that I think that many of the resilience solutions at the national level in particular are within the realm of areas that we know so well and have been experimenting with under different labels in the past. So for example, if you take food supply, for example, there's been so much research showing that diverse cropping systems, avoiding over 50% dependence on food imports, that you have a certain degree of food security as food self-sufficiency. These are lessons learned that actually lend themselves to more resilient food supply for your population. Look at energy, for example. I remember being part of a major effort of trying to build up renewable energy developments in Tanzania. And one important argument there from the government was actually that the majority of foreign currency earnings by the state in Tanzania are used to import oil because Tanzania is not an oil nation. So, of course, a very interesting resilience strategy for Tanzania is to invest in locally produced solar energy and biofuels from sustainable forms of ethanol production, and thereby retaining all the foreign currency, avoiding dependence on imports on fossil fuel energy systems, contributing to mitigating climate change, and being more resilient. You can find example after example after example, infrastructure in urban areas, public transport systems, avoid a monoculture of private transport to have a diverse system of public transport. Bicycles in cities might seem like a small issue, but it's a form of diversity of social resilience. So I think you can easily take a resilience concept and make a strategy for your nation and suddenly realize, oh my God, we have a lot of experience here. We actually have a toolbox that we can play with. And we can actually see quite quickly systems that make us more vulnerable and thereby are less attractive. So it's not as if it's magic neither. I mean, we don't have all the answers, but I think there are interesting things that can take us towards a more resilient direction.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I guess that also links to the fact that we're not the first people that are kind of perturbed with mainstream development.
No.
I think that the development model as it was determined, say, in the late 1950s is not one that necessarily everyone buys into, and nation states have been experimenting and communities have been experimenting. And I guess that, that's just what we're also building on that wave. We're certainly not pretending to be the first ones who've thought about this.
Yeah, that's right.
I did also want to reflect that there are quite a few questions coming through that are quite specific. And I don't want to make people feel that we're not going to get to those. We do still have a number of weeks of the MOOC to run. So I feel like we don't want to give away all the answers now. Some of these questions we may only be able to answer in about 20 years. But a couple of them I think we're hopefully going to address in future MOOCs. There are a few coming through about what is the GRADE program. Can you tell us more about it? What I can offer is to put a bit of information together that we could then put for people to read a bit more about GRADE if they're interested, rather than talking about it now.
Yeah, I think that's nice.
Yeah.
And use our time here. So I think we probably only have time for one last question here. So we'll scroll through and see what we get. There's some coming up. So I think this is a nice one. We talk about sustainability and the intergenerational connection. Yeah?
Yes.
And so maybe a nice one to come in from a question around PhD students and young researchers. So
quite a few.
We'll end on this question of the role of youth. And well, I shouldn't say that. The PhD student, I wasn't necessarily a youth when I was doing one, but
early career.
Yeah, early career. So what is the role of the next generation in transforming development? And I think that's a nice reflection to end on. What can the younger generation do? And it can sometimes feel overwhelming. How do you find agency in these systems that seem so troubled, and these systems that seem so rigid and have been created long before you were born? And and is it better to kind of go in and try and create change in the system, or to just reject it and stay outside of it? What are the range of options? So any positive thoughts or supportive words of encouragement or ideas?
I guess partly there's some positives I see that, PhD programs have never been as well aligned in some ways. That the challenges of doing an interdisciplinary PhD, which existed 20 years ago for me, don't exist really anymore in many contexts. The challenges of doing a PhD on a topic that actually has application and relevance to development is also entirely possible now. It's not sort of constrained to the types of theses we were writing all those years ago. So I feel like there's an opening up of the opportunities to study and spend a lot of time thinking deeply about these problems, which is what a PhD is, right? It's a chance to think really deeply, read really widely, and come up with some new insights. So that's fantastically exciting, I think, to find those PhD programs. I guess that's then also put against the fact that you're just so much more aware of the scale of the challenge now, right? I don't know, maybe the challenge wasn't so big 20 years ago, but it certainly wasn't as well connected on social media and the news that we knew about things before they even happened. So, I can understand that there's a tension there, that the opportunities in some ways have been greater. The challenges as well probably also seem a lot greater now. And I don't know whether that's just a perception. But I think that I can also imagine that that's a pretty tricky one to navigate, the sort of difference between being a PhD and being an activist, or being a PhD and being a practitioner. Opportunities seem to be there. So I think the answer to that is yes, please. More of you, for sure. But I can also imagine that there are big challenges about how do you actually engage in something that is so huge and so complex when you can only study one small part of it. Yeah. But maybe there's also opportunities for more collaborative PhDs, not just trying to do this by yourself.
Yeah, different models there.
I fully support this, that it's actually a very exciting time to be a young scholar entering in PhD programs, because we're seeing this exponential rise in attraction and recognition of interdisciplinary sustainability studies and science and opportunities. So if you go into this is a very clever career step. But the only remark I'd like to make is that we discussed earlier about worldviews and values. I think to begin with, of course, we should recognize the urgency situation we're in. So it's a big mistake to say that, look, we give up on the elder generation and simply rely on a younger generation to solve our problems, because that's apart from being irresponsible and immoral, we don't have time for that.
Yeah.
But there is an interesting but. I would argue that, the millennials or the younger generation, those who are in their 20s today, they are already configured in a reconnected worldview, generally speaking. If you look at the climate denialism in the world, it's largely male and it's 50 plus. You know, you find very few young people who haven't recognized that we are in a globalized phase. We are facing challenges. Sustainability is actually the pathway for me to have a life that is really, really positive in the future. So I think just like it took one generation to understand that passive smoking leads to cancer, is therefore unacceptable. And today you would basically throw out, if someone would start smoking on an airplane, you would basically just lynch the person and throw him or her out. But, you know, it's not more than 20 years ago, everyone was doing it. I think we were soon at that point when it comes to sustainability. That, you know, if you walk down the street and somebody says, my God, this climate change is just a hoax, you'll just throw him down the drain, basically, because we're at this tipping point. And I think that's a very promising. And so I would say the younger generation needs to help us put even more pressure in the system, because I think that's where the positive pressure really is today. And it's something to cherish, actually.
Yeah. And I guess just adding to that is what's really exciting about this MOOC and who's signing up is it's not just the younger groups from Europe or from the US. We're seeing people signing up from all over the world. And, you know, I still think this idea of sort of a global collaboration is really where a lot of the promise lies, in actually bringing PhD students together from around the world, exchanges, fellowships, those sorts of things. And I'm seeing more and more of those opportunities, because I don't think, you know, we can rely on one region to solve the problems of the world for other regions. It really should be an interregional cooperation. And so it's good to see these kinds of initiatives and this MOOC really signaling that interest from more than just the usual suspects.
And we're thrilled to have, I mean, in many ways, we've shaped this course around development practitioners, but we're thrilled that there are students engaging with us. And I think that, I mean, I guess what I would offer into that space is, you know, we don't have the luxury of picking who contributes to transformations by age. You know, I think we all have a role, and especially as we were talking about earlier, but we're just at this kind of precipice of, we need to figure this out about how do we transform what is mainstream development. And there is going to be this period of experimentation and diversification. And so there is going to be lots of opportunity for, regardless of generation, or whether you're just starting your career or not. But I think also it's nice to go back to remembering the positives of, we've had major social transformations, at least in our lifetimes, you know, in your lifetime, apartheid regime in South Africa, the Berlin Wall coming down in Germany. I mean, and often without, you know, there were long struggles leading up to them, but the actual tipping point was hard to predict in terms of how, and so these aren't things that you necessarily can see. And so we do need to keep making the effort and putting things in place that kind of keep building those, preparing those systems to change, and trying to figure out what are the alternatives from where we go forward from there. So I think we are out of time now. I realize there are many questions still coming in. We really appreciate that everybody's been contributing, and hope that the discussion threads will continue. There's lots of groups there already starting up. This is just the beginning of the course. We have 6 more weeks after this, and more live question and answer sessions as well that will be coming in future weeks. So thank you very much, Juan. Thank you very much, Belinda. And thank you very much to all the participants. We're really looking forward to going on this journey with you for the next few weeks.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thanks.